This is part 2 of what might eventually be a 3-part series on a project of mine for trying to determine patterns in bodies of Armory. And I am Oddr Þiálfason, companion of the Order of the Pelican from Ontario. Live in the foothills east of Washington. The view behind me is not quite my backyard, only because there's a hill in the way. I've been Kingdom Submissions and Principal Herald for Ontario in the past, and by the time this event is over and Cormac has successfully fled, I will be Wreath Sovereign of Arms. I am currently apprentice to Countess Elizabeth de Rossignol, Pomegranate Herald Extraordinary, and all-around legend in the field. I've only given this talk once before and came out just about on time for it, so hopefully we can maintain this record. General overview for the talk is a general discussion of what an armorial is for those at this point from a glance, probably very few of you who
Did we lose audio?
Have we lost Oddr?
Yep, I lost audio.
Okay. Let's kind of yell at him in the
Cannot
chat
hear
window.
are you hearing me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so I just switched it back to where it was when they lost audio before. So, you know, I'll just have to keep swapping them. Where did you lose me?
What is an armorial?
Okay, so for those very few who don't already know one, we'll go through, you know, basically the armorials in question for this study, what they are, what some of their characteristics are. Also, we'll go into what I mean by an armorial pattern, as well as the draft results of the analysis I performed. And then we'll go into a Q&A if you aren't already sleeping. So, this is an image of the Zurich roll. Basically, it's an example of an armorial, one of the earliest extant ones we have. It's basically a record of the coat armor. So what was on their shields, what was on their tabards identifying people, what was on their banners. Frequently, the images are shown. Sometimes it's just a list of the blazon. Sometimes it's both. Very frequently, you'll find the names associated with them. So we've got extant copies, such as this one from the mid-13th century. There are several hundred of them, very much largely in university and institutional collections and private collections, which is very good for us since lately they've been scanning them. I myself have a couple dozen sitting on my computer, and they're just great fun to go browse around, and you can learn some really oddball things that were going on. And you start getting impressions that, you know, the aesthetics of England were different from the aesthetics of Italy or Germany or Iberia. Sometimes it's, you know, what is the shape of the shield they use? You know, what are their predominant colors? What sort of charges did they prefer? How did they mix them together? And so, yeah, this is what we get. You know, we get the idea of, you know, what are the tinctures, what are the charges, what is the structure we find in them. This one, for example, on the left is a charge out of the Zurich roll. On the right is the same arms in Tyrrell's Wappenbuch, drawn 2 centuries later. It's the same family, we know this, and if we look, we'll eventually see that, yeah, one was simply a stylization of the other. This is one of the things that, you know, armorials can teach us is, you know, how did people depict things and how did it change over time? One of the books in my library shows a series of 6 eagles, and they go from, you know, this very simple, straightforward early period depiction of an eagle. You can recognize it as a bird, And as time goes on, you see that he's getting really, really frustrated over having held the same pose for 400 years as he gets more and more. Ah! So that's one of the things Armorials can teach us. One of the badges I registered, probably about 10 years ago, was registered specifically to highlight the differences in how, say, unicorns were depicted between Anglo-Norman and German, like these sorts of differences. So England, well, this one actually has his horn going straight down his nose instead of sitting out like a spike like the one in Italy here. People in Germany seem to be agreeing with people in England on this factor. England, now I have to say, yes, English unicorns should have lion's tails, shouldn't they? But doesn't that one look a lot like a horse tail? I didn't choose to go through that in any sort of submission, but maybe someone will eventually, probably after I'm wreath, probably after I've stepped down, right? Meanwhile, the German and Italian depictions show increasingly short, more goat-like tails. And then given an entire armorial, you can see, okay, well, how popular was a particular style? If this could be, of course, measuring popularity because it was all drawn by the same artist, or if you happen to know that there are many artists involved, or they were showing, true to the family's depiction, basically what are the various aesthetics. So as one can imagine, going through a manuscript with thousands and thousands of images and coming up with some sort of quantifiable idea of how often, just for example, how often was ghouls used, can be an endeavor. Here's the daring roll, and Cormac should be very familiar with it because I completely cribbed from him. It's late 13th century, 324 shields. Cormac did an analysis on it. Zurich roll, semi-contemporary to it, found in a different part of Europe. Somewhat more pieces of armory than the daring roll. And I want to find out, what are their differences? So this is where I start framing my idea of analysis. Traditionally, analyses end up taking the form of, here is how often I found ghouls. Here is how often I found basically some predetermined set of things that you chose to look for. Whether you're trying to be a completionist and you're only interested in a couple colors, but you decided to make better use of your time and just get them all anyway. But I want to go deeper than that. So how often was a tincture found with a particular posture or a particular arrangement or a particular count? Was there an obsession that the number 3 suddenly meant you had to use blue or something? Lions, if there were 3 lions, were they always gold? And the relationships between charge groups. If you have a primary lion, how often do you find a chief? How often do you find a mulletin canton or something like that? And so, we are faced with, okay, we have our traditional approach. We determine the questions, and we figure out what sort of information is necessary to answer those questions. And we start getting into how do we encode that information so that we can figure out what those answers are. That's going to strongly, the choices you make, they're going to strongly influence how and whether the analysis is even possible. You can represent the same information in a variety of ways to a computer. Some of those ways can make it completely intractable to extract what sort of information you want out of it. While other ways that have the same bit of information happen to be expressed in a form that a computer can absolutely dance all over it and tell you everything you never wanted to know. And along the way, the way you do that, whether it's possible, also whether the way it's structured can start hiding interesting patterns. You may be, as a programmer, I'd say it'd be a lossy translation. So, you might list, say we're just looking at a family tree. You can have the family tree and it starts at the parents and it branches down to the children, and you're seeing in full fidelity basically a timeline of how the family grew and evolved. Or you can just list everyone's names and say their approximate ages and occasionally whether one married into the family from outside. You have almost the exact same information. Someone looking at it might be hard-pressed to figure out what's missing. But one of those will be able to tell you that this person was this other person's second cousin once removed. And given enough information, you might discover that every second cousin once removed always shared the same name. If you're on Ancestry.com, go back far enough, you'll sometimes hit patronymic loops where everyone is starting to name themselves Eric Erickson. You go off into infinity. Same thing can happen with Armory, only hopefully you hopefully it's the sort of thing that you're actually wanting to learn. If it isn't, well, of course you did something wrong. So this is when we start pulling out Excel and start littering a spreadsheet with several dozen columns. And I'll pick on Cormac. He's been gracious enough, and this was really good work, and a lot of effort was gone into it. And he got some really good results. So the daring rule, 2/3 of the shields happened to use ghouls. Half of them used argent. Another half used ore, and so forth. Goodness, purr used in only one instance. This is definitely not the SCA, isn't it? Green used in only 3 instances. Again, not the SCA. This sort of information is the sort of thing that would guide us during consult if we're trying to help people get more plausible arms. This is the exact sort of information that is useful if we have to do an individually attested pattern. More interesting results that Cormac came up was, nearly 3/4 of shields were only 2 tinctures. The SCA is the kaleidoscope of color. The primary charges, out of all of them, only 2 of them were weapons. No primary charge group, as we would understand it, had multiple types of charges. And it goes on and on and on. A whole lot of great results from him, and there's a link. You can download the slide deck from the symposium page, and you'll be able to retain it from there, and you can go read it. But I have some complaints about the process, and I have to move the pictures out of the way so I can actually remember what my complaints were. Okay, yeah, so it requires a large spreadsheet. It requires a lot of hand entry. And anyone who's done data entry knows this is a very error-prone process. It's also a very high barrier to getting any of this done. One of Juliana's big complaints since SANA was established was she was really hoping that this would open up the doorway to there being a lot of armorial research in order to enable the individually attested patterns to be used and produce a lot of highly plausible armory in the society. And that hasn't happened. And I believe that hasn't happened because our tools for doing so have been inadequate to the task. One of the inadequacies is it's really hard to reuse that work. In order to make use of Cormac spreadsheet, I would basically have to re-enter or very deeply perform surgery on it. That's another big barrier to getting any of this done. It's also limited to the sort of questions that you think of asking ahead of time. Part of the limitation is, yes, whether we think to ask it. The other limitation is, Excel is great at doing financial calculations of a tabular nature. Armory isn't financial, and Armory isn't tabular. There's this big mismatch in how we think about Armory and the questions we might ask of it. And so, being the sort of person I am, I decided it'd be interesting to come up with a new approach. And the sort of person I am is a software engineer with a background in certain branches of software engineering that just happened to be on my mind at the time, and it turned out to be somewhat useful. So what I wanted to create was an engine that I could put Blazon in at the beginning and get answers to questions I never asked at the end. And so there are several steps. That one is, yes, collecting the Blazon. We don't have anything where a computer can actually go and tell us appropriate, well-formed Blazon based on just pointing it to some, 600-700-year-old scrivener's sketch in some, half-decayed manuscript. We just don't have that. And the different styles that were in use over time would make that, honestly, I think, intractable. Maybe in another 50 to 100 years of technological advance, but certainly not today. So as long as we can get Blazon, and for many of them we can, a lot of people have come before us and have cataloged these things over the centuries, not just folks on St. Gabriel. Given that, how can we get a computer to interpret Blazon? There are various approaches. Some of them are still under research and development under, say, full field natural language processing. This is the same sort of thing that powers, say, Siri or Google Assistant or Cortana on Microsoft platform. The idea of trying to determine intent from a sequence of words. That is a part that I have not yet worked in. So instead, the approach that I will eventually choose is brute force. So just finding a pattern of words and trying to assign meaning. It's the same sort of process that you went through in junior high when your English teacher is telling you to diagram a sentence. You look at it and you say, okay, yes, this is a noun, this is a verb. And then, once you start reducing them down, you can start seeing the interrelationships. So given these interrelationships, ask the computer to find all possible patterns, all possible relationships between things going on in that piece of Armory. And it'll be, and having it find things that you wouldn't even think to find. Or, to be honest, would not have enough time in your entire life of working continuously at it from birth until death to find. And then given that, start finding out what answers you get to the questions you have, as well as the ones that you didn't even think to ask. So I've mentioned relationships several times so far. And so here's where we start going into the part where I tried very hard not to require anyone to have a degree in mathematics or experience in computer programming. So, I'm trying very hard on the pictures. Please feel free to ask the question of what it means, probably in about 3 slides. So, given a piece of armor with a Blazon, they're on the left. So we have a vertically divided field. It's white on the left, black on the right. You have a big lion in the middle, all in red. Across the top, you have this red chief, and on that chief, you have 3 white roundels. So that's our very succinct way of being able to describe the picture. On the right-hand side is another way to describe that picture. And the way you describe it is I have this piece of Armory, and on this piece of Armory, we have a field, we have this primary group, and we have a secondary group. The field has a partition, and that partition happens to be per pale, and it has two colors associated with that, argent and sable, in that order. The primary has the ideas of 1, this will be of course the count, has the idea of a lion, what type of charge it is. Has rampant didn't show up in the blazon, but being who we are, we'll presume is rampant because almost all lions were anyway. And it happened to be ghouls in color. And off the secondary, by similar concepts, we have 1 chief ghouls. And off the secondary, we have a tertiary group that is 3 roundels argent. So just like a family tree, we can start getting some of the ways the various pieces worked together. And that happens to be a type of data structure that is very interesting in computer science these days. It's what powers Facebook, it's what powers Microsoft's Office Graph, and the various other major tech companies also work on very similar concepts. And they can do some very, very fascinating things like, oh, decide to offer you advertisement because 3 of your friends happen to be, you know, in the Boy Scouts or something. So that was an example of the entire Armory. But we can take individual chunks of it. And those chunks are what I'm referring to as patterns. So on the left, the idea that there is a field that is per pale and one side or the other happens to be argent. Or that any particular single thing happens to be ghouls in color. Or that there is a piece of Armory with a primary charge group that consists of 1 charge and a secondary charge group that has a tertiary charge group on it. You know, the first 2 things are things that, you know, traditionally we would think of in an analysis because they're small and easy and self-contained and really, really comparatively easy to encode. The second one, you'd be hard pressed to, you know, create a spreadsheet that could actually really tell you that. I mean, Cormac's spreadsheet was 50 columns wide, and the nature of the data that he was able to get together, you know, covered certainly quite a bit of ground. I don't think it would have been possible to come up with that third one. So we have to mouse these things around here. Given this process in the software I wrote, it comes in 4 stages. We import the data, and part of that, you know, is digesting the blazon, and it starts creating the relationships, and it stores them in a database. Then we go through all of them, and for each one of them, we go through and find every single possible subpattern. So every group of 2 or more of those blocks in the diagram. Every single one of them. And to give you an idea of how many of them there are, if you remember from your math class, what happens when you stick an exclamation point after a number? So you got 5 exclamation point. That evaluates out to 5 times 4 times 3 times 2, which is 120. The numbers in these cases are closer to about 20 to 25. So these are vast, vast amounts of possible patterns in a worst case scenario. Thankfully, we don't generally hit that worst case scenario because Armory is a very constrained language, at least the way we in the SCA tend to dissect Armory. And then among all that, we want to find sets of Armory. That is, for the pattern of X happens to be ghouls. This piece of Armory had it, this other piece of Armory had it. You know, these out of 800 pieces of Armory, about 400 or 500 of them have it, and which ones those were. And then, okay, among those sets of Armory that were all ghouls, what were all the patterns that they had in common? So we can get, ways to reduce the data by saying that, yes, these all had X ghouls, but more to the point, we can say they all had a lion ghouls. This will start to make things a little more tractable for the last step, which is simply computing these statistics. We'll pare down a lot of the information, because right in the middle of this is one of the biggest explosions that, as a software engineer, I could ever encounter in my work. And off the end, this is the results that we get. So we're comparing Cormac's analysis of the daring roll to my analysis of both the daring and the Zurich rolls. And we're doing this on Tincture, because those are fairly easy to get, nice, good ballpark answers. And there's pretty high agreement, some difference between the tallies for ghouls between him and me. Argents within 1%. In looking back to them, yeah, they're all very, very close to each other. We're probably, this could be at the level of typos. And yes, both of us found the one case that had purple in it. And then we get to the Zurich roll. Ghouls occurred only in half of the Zurich roll, not 2/3. Similarly, Argent was in 2/3 of the Zurich roll, but just only half of the daring roll. Gold was used in slightly different fractions. All of these were used in slightly different fractions. Vert was much more common in the Zurich roll than ever in the daring roll. About the only place where they really agree is that basically no one uses purple. So based on this, I start to feel very confident about my approach. And that leads us to, what do I see in the data as a whole that I get? Remember, this is analyzing two different cultures and trying to find their aesthetics, trying to find their biases. So the chart here on the left is a plot for each pattern that I found of how frequently it was found in the daring roll versus how frequently it was found in the Zurich roll. And we see, by and large, they go in this nice, gentle slope that indicates roughly there's some idea of a coherent design to Armory. That is to say, if the English had an idea about Armory, the Germans had a similar idea. They may have felt more or less strongly about it, but they still had the same general idea. And I see that there are questions flashing. I'll get to those here in a few more slides. I think I'll be done, then I'll go through the Q&A. But we also see that there are these bands where things are clustered together. I will say off the top that the ones that are very close together are what you would see if you just tweaked a pattern very slightly. You went from anything ghouls to a lion ghouls or something like that. But I want to expand this out further. And so I'm finding the difference between how frequently something shows up on the daring roll versus how frequently something shows up on the Zurich roll. And across the horizontal is how common was the pattern found in the entire data set, the combined data set. Off on the right, these are things that were found in everything, which means they were found, not just common in the daring roll and common in the Zurich roll, but basically every single one of them had the thing going on. So you would expect then that the difference between the Zurich and daring roll would be practically zero, and that is what we see. We see the same thing on the far left when things that hardly showed up at all are. And in the middle, we start seeing these bands. And we see that most things are within this 20% wide band centered around 0, where we can probably say that there is negligible difference between the two cultures. That's all fine and good, and we see that most things are there. But then we get these outliers, like the clusters there at about 35% commonality and about 35% bias toward the daring roll. Those are about the most extreme in this entire data set. And I have them listed on one of the slides following. And this is what we have. So those clusters at top, with this 34% bias between the daring and Zurich rolls, were the pieces of Armory that had uncharged plain tinctured ordinaries in any charge group. So, you know, chevrons, chevrons of just a single color. They could be chevrons, you know, that happen to be on a canton, or generally speaking, we happen to know, no, they were the chevrons that were directly on the field, you know, in your primary group, primary or secondary group. Following them, we have the same idea, only the tincture happens to be one of the dark tinctures, so ghouls, you know, generally speaking, or sable or azure. And we see, you know, the daring roll and the Zurich roll, neither one of them had too many of them. They were almost unknown in the Zurich roll. They were only known in about a third of the pieces of Armory in the daring roll. And again, say a light tincture used on a field with no secondary or overall charges. That was a pattern that showed up in more than half of the Zurich roll and only a third of the daring roll. Similarly, for a primary charge group that had a single plain tincture charge, no tertiaries, no secondaries, and no overall charges. Again, about half of the Zurich roll could satisfy that. The English, they didn't like that pattern nearly as much. And then, knowing this, well, you can start asking a question that, yeah, you can ask it. It might not necessarily be one that really has valid interpretation, but it's a fun exercise. I really wanted to see if I could do that. And that was to find Armory that was, say, in the daring roll, for example, that exhibited a pattern that was substantially more common in the Zurich roll. And yeah, so, you know, things that, you know, were weird regionally, you know, you'd look at them, and based on that one pattern alone, you might think that, oh, really, it just came from this other culture. And that of course is the danger. A single pattern does not actually Armory design make. You know, it's the sort of thing that you can start trying to nudge aesthetics out of. But I did this anyway. So Argent Lion Ghouls, yeah, if we were to look at that, you know, that falls much more in line with the sorts of Armory that we see in the Zurich roll. Nevertheless, it came out of England. Change that lion to black and add Crucially Ghouls to it, you know, similar results. On the other side, Ghouls Assaultier Ver. You know, Ver, yeah, not necessarily something we necessarily see too frequently, but that wasn't what it was really picking up on. What it was picking up on was the idea that it's an uncharged plain tinctured ordinary, which, you know, Zurich roll doesn't have nearly as many of those, but the daring roll certainly does, especially if you just glance at it, you'll start seeing that. And the idea of you know, just anything that is plain tinctured ghouls, yeah, we see that more common in the daring roll. Example blazon here was Ghouls 2, Threshing Flails, Adorst, Argent, Hafted, and Issuant from a Tri-Mount, Issuant from Base Vert. Of course, looking at that, yeah, that's German. It's not the sort of thing you'd really see in the daring roll. But still interesting that, that sort of thing, popped up. These are departures from the regional norms. This is about where I am. Really, the biggest problem I have is my current analysis takes about a day and a half on my laptop to execute. And that assumes it actually completes successfully. The last time I ran it, it ran in memory, and my laptop's not that small. So what I'm doing is I'm working on rewriting it into a high performance language called Rust. It's also just an excuse for me to learn another language. I do that about every decade, which should help in at least the time spent trying to churn out all the distinct patterns it finds. And there are somewhere around 29 million across 807 or so pieces of Armory. The other hard part that I need to look at is making it straightforward for people who are not me to tell a computer how to interpret Blazon, so that it can take that text and turn it into this graph, this nice little tree structure, such that the rest of the thing can simply dance all over it. Those are both things that are current and ongoing, and after tomorrow night will probably slow down for me, but it is certainly my goal, and I already have several colleagues of mine interested in taking and applying to places like Italy, in particular. For those who aren't familiar with Armory in Italy, to say it's a trip is saying something. This is where we start getting a lot of the ecclesiastical armory, with gold charges on argent fields, or really interesting patterns such as beasts on floating islands, flanked by trees, and floating in this big star-speckled sky, where we start having difficulties with trying to figure out how to describe it in Blazon, let alone how we fit it into our model of what Armory in the SCA means. What is our idea of core style? Being able to do this, being able to do it across all the major cultures that we have, starts giving us the ability to take a look at our own practices and see where, okay, maybe we're being a little too English focused. Maybe we have this wrong impression when we actually look deeper about certain presumptions we make about armorial style. And really, of course, one of the big motivations was I hadn't heard of anyone actually trying this approach before, and it is interesting to do it. This is the sort of thing that you might do more, say, in biopharmaceutical research, trying to find the ways drugs interact with metabolism. The same sort of data structures are used, which is actually how I got introduced to it about 10 years ago. And so that's the end of the slide deck. And let's go on and start working through questions. Is anyone still alive?
That's super interesting. How much of your of the Blazon parsing code is sort of independent of the rest of the code base? Because I can imagine that's got a sort of a bunch of independent applications.
So when I did the presentation for Ontier's Heraldry Symposium this last fall, everything at that point was hard-coded into a single C# application. Everything, including the data set itself. Pulling the data set out was a very quick thing for me to do. And, so I got that taken care of long about November. The problem I'm having now is I have to come up with a simple human usable language that can be used to describe to a computer, okay, this sequence of we'll call it parts of speech, like tincture, count, charge type, posture, tincture. This particular sequence turns into this particular representation. So we can say that, oh, the tincture that occurs in the first position, and it happens to be followed by count, obviously that tincture represents a field that is plain tinctured that has this tincture. And being able to build up those structures. That's the part where I'm actually starting to eye natural language processing as a technique, something I've never really done before, but worth knowing these days. I've been programming since the early 80s and getting paid for it for 20 years, and the last 5 to 10 years alone have been tremendously interesting as far as the advances and focus being paid toward NLP in particular. And I think it could probably be very interesting to applying it to Blazon, especially since Blazon as a language is actually a pretty constrained language. It's not as free-flowing as English, which thank you Latin, we're so loosey-goosey on our syntax. It'd be the sort of thing that, okay, yeah, maybe it'd be a dead shot if it was on Lojban or some logic-based spoken language like that, but it's not. But thankfully, Blazon, at least as SEA Heralds will produce it, is going to fall within this very rigid pattern, which greatly reduces the number of cases we have to consider. Out of 800 pieces of Armory, there were only about 200 different sequences of word types that I had to consider. So let me scroll all the way back up here. The slide deck was full screen on me, so I did not get to see any of this here. Audio gone. Okay, yeah, that's when my computer hated Zoom.
Just letting you know, 15 minutes.
Hey, good. I did about the same time last time too. I'm getting better. I used to go, twice as long over. Metadata schemas specific to cataloging visual arts. Did I investigate them? No, I don't, or didn't rather. The sorts of things that I'm needing to do is describe the structure. So if there was a structural language for doing that, that would be an immediate target for this. That would be exactly the sort of thing. The sort of language that I did use was basically just a semantic web graph. So, two concepts and a relationship between them.
I was probably a bit too quick to ask that. Yeah, I can see how natural language processing is now a much better fit.
I do go into much more technical detail in the article that is linked on the Known World site. That actually also has it has the full set of the things that are more than 20% different between the during roll and Zurich roll. There's I think about 2 dozen small patterns on that. I did not have the time to rerun the analysis and come up with the 14,300 or so distinct patterns that show up, let alone the 29 million individual ones that you get before you start reducing them all down. Yeah, this is the first time I ever tried generating a 50 gigabyte database, and willingly on my own computer. It was toasting my lap there for a while. Let's see. I should point out the analysis was done simultaneously on both the Daring and Zurich roll pooled together, which is how I was able to help. It was how I was able to compare them to begin with. If they would have been generated in different runs, then the Daring roll would exhibit a different set of patterns from the Zurich roll. Putting them together means that I'm just using the same set of patterns to describe both. I could do it with 3 Armorials, 4, 5. And at that point, we start getting limited by how fast your computer can work and what its resources are. Yeah, math jokes. Sarah knows my deep, dark secret. Let's see. Morso says brute force blades and parsing. There have been a number of blades and parsers. When I was first investigating this about 2003 or so, I noticed this was actually a subject of people's doctoral theses, and from what I could tell, they didn't get all that far, enough to start classifying what sort of grammar it is in the broader sense, which was actually part of why I ended up going on the approach I did, and going in for the more brute force, just pattern matching. I don't have that much experience writing parsers, let alone using parser lexer generators like Antler or anything like that. It's just the sort of thing that hasn't come up with my day job. Yeah, David and Zenobia, Liz gave me one of David's Scott's books right after I became her apprentice. So it's quite possible I actually have one of the books he worked out of. Let's see, biometrics. Yeah. My introduction to .NET was bioinformatics. So yeah. Eleazar mentions might use it to study the evolution of SCA arms. Yes, absolutely. That is one of the goals I'd like to do. Just so we can, see, the influence. What sort of armory did we get before and after Sena? What was just how scary was Heraldicon? And Dorcas mentions the modest proposal to the same effect. Okay, good. So Sarah's going to teach me NLP. I'll take her up on that. Too bad she already volunteered.
10 minutes.
Declan asks if, thank you, Frida. Declan asks if artificial intelligence and a DB of use. These are all things that are parts of an artificial intelligence system. So things that can interpret language, or at least try to get intent out of it, even if it ignores half the words. They provide the illusion of intelligence in some sort of conversational agent, when really it's just picking up a few things, like we used to do with in the old days. Let's see. Rosina, how well does this work to find examples for IAPs? So the work that it does to discover all the pieces of Armory that satisfy a certain pattern, like something as ghouls, that is the exact same sort of question that you would be asking if you were to if you're wanting to find an IAP. You would end up describing the IAP as a set of relationships, and you would ask what items satisfy this relationship. It would find things that satisfy that relationship plus all those other relationships. So you'd probably be discarding a few things, because part of IAP is you're attempting to find things that closely match. So if what you're looking for is a plain field and a primary charge group, yeah, you can ask for that. You may need to assert that there are no secondary or debrucing charge groups, and that perhaps there are no tertiaries. If that doesn't provide enough, then yeah, you'll need to start tweaking it around and start feeling your way around that space. But yeah, absolutely, this would be the sort of thing that you would use to find. My database would find this very quickly, but that's because, you know, probably about 90% of that is a huge index. Do I code or allow for cadency? I don't describe cadency at all. I simply describe what is on the what is on the Armory. If there's a label, I say there's a label. I don't state that, oh, this is these arms, they just happen to be cadet differenced. I don't encode for that. You could say potentially write a rule that searches for these sorts of relationships and marks the Armory as, you know, this may well be cadenced arms from this one branch. So nobody asked, do I categorize changes in some way that indicates that a flail is intrinsically a different type of charge than an animate charge? I do have the idea of type of charge, as opposed to, you know, I should say, both the type of charge and what class of charge type it is. So for example, in there I do have information, thank you Frida, that says lions and catamounts are both cats. Talbots and wolves are both, you know, dogs. I do have that sort of relationship. Similarly, if you go to the handout and take a look at the data set, you'll see that not only do I have the tinctures, but I have the idea of light and dark and neutral. I believe I also have in there, you know, as you know, you might have for or ghouls or ver.
It's just the fact that ver and the ermine tinctures are considered just a plain old tincture is also interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have anything, and I don't think we actually had any examples in this data set of, you know, X ermined Y. I think we just had the pure common ermines. See, orientation of charges. I do have posture of animate charges. I think I do have orientation of charges listed in there. But perhaps not. Orientation of charges can be very situational. If you have, say, a long charge sitting on the border, like an ermine spot on a bordure, you know, is it bendwise or is it palewise? You know, generally they follow the edge of the shield. They don't necessarily have to, but generally speaking, it's about the only way to make them visible. So I'd have to take a look at my software again to see if I'm actually encoding specific orientation for things like that. But certainly postures for animate charges, for a number of them I do. I can't say it was necessarily exhaustive. A lot of this was experimental here. Scott's basically had much less diversity of charge type, but more complicated designs. One of the other things that I was interested in doing was, given these structures, try to determine what is the SCA complexity count. That would be an easy one to go through. I mean, you just go through and, okay, yes, I got these sets of tinctures, and I've got these sense, thank you Frida, these types of charges. Oh, good, Elspeth, the parser is something. Yeah, you would. Let's see, Rose asks about crowdsourced computer time like SETI at home. Yeah, somewhere along the line that did cross my mind. I used to run SETI at home there for a while. Scary people to do NLP blank form. And that takes us to the end and Eric's question of how adaptable is the coding to other armories currently. The big problem is getting the translation from blazon pattern to that tree structure. Once that's more or less conquered, it may well be that we can just send it a text file full of blazon and some metadata saying that this was found in the 13th century England, and it was drawn by this artist or something or whatever like that, and just see what comes out the other end. That would certainly be my goal. I'm going to be in office for 3 years, and I'm probably not going to be able to touch this for 3 years. At some point, I am planning on sticking it somewhere public so that other people more experienced than me in certain fields, who might have privately messaged me, could come in and have fun with it. But it depends on whether learning Rust scares them, because that's a very interesting and somewhat masochistic language, but it's actually turning out a lot more fun than I should probably admit to. So 1 minute, and any last questions before we go?
Thank you for sharing that. That's super interesting.
Glad you liked it.